Hello to all everyone who just tuned in from YouTube, all probably 5 people watching. But today marks the beginning of probably the most important week in this course because this week we're going to learn how to actually deliver a speech in Comms 103. We're going to learn all the necessary skills you need to practice for when you deliver your first graded speech. I cannot emphasize the importance of that particular unit, chapters 9 and 10, because if you've seen some of your past speech rubrics, you'll see that most of your speech grade isn't really about your speech content. It's not really about what you're saying. It's about how you're saying it. This is probably one of the only classes you're going to take where you're not just going to be graded based on your words, based on your writing, based on your content, but based on how you use your hands, how often you move around your physical space, where are you putting your eye contact, are you changing your voice throughout, and so on. We're going to learn each of those techniques on, I want to say Wednesday when we cover chapter 10, but I cannot emphasize enough just how important it is that you learn and begin practicing these skills, because you're not just going to be graded on them for the speech of introduction. You're going to be graded for the exact same skill set for the informative speech, for the persuasive speech, and so on. So if you're going to mark down any particular chapter to pay close attention to, I cannot stress this enough, chapter 10, you really want to read it front and back, and you really want to pay close attention to our lecture on Wednesday. For a preview for this week, we're going to be covering chapter 9 today. I'm going to be going over the activity that's due on Friday. And I'm also going to give you a brief walkthrough on Canvas on how to actually look up your feedback for your speech outlines. I haven't had any of them graded yet. I wanted to give you a little bit of a walkthrough on how to actually access that grade, but I'll have those graded probably by, I want to say, tomorrow or Wednesday at the latest. I just rushed through a lot of content, but does anyone have any questions for me about the course, about the speech, anything at all before we get started? Okay, well, if you have any questions, just go ahead and click the raise hand button. First, I would like to just jump in and go to Canvas and show you how to actually access your speech feedback. So right now I'm in the test student view, and just giving a little bit of a brief walkthrough. After I've graded your speech outline, I always put some form of feedback, some kind of comments letting you know what you can improve for the future. It's the entire point of submitting an outline for a grade is so that I can give you that feedback. You can then change it for your actual speech. You're free to change any element of your outline before you actually give your speech. It's not going to have it open. It's not going to have your outline open on a separate screen, cross-checking to make sure you're getting every word exactly right. You're more than encouraged to change any element before you actually deliver your speech. It's the entire point of the process. To actually access that feedback, you just go back to the submission link, speech of introduction outline. You click that, and it's going to come up, and you can click view rubric evaluation. That's going to show the individual score you got on each element of your speech rubric. It's also going to show some comments I might write in each of these boxes. So if it shows that you got a 3 out of 5 on your body, there's going to be some comments in that box just briefly explaining what you could improve for the future. I can also, one second, I'm being clumsy. I can also comment on specific parts of your speech outline. How you see those comments is you click on submission details right here on the top right. You click view feedback again in the top right. It's going to pull up a copy of your outline, and I can make annotations, comments about specific sections of your outline. I can highlight certain key phrases or sentences. I can tack with little pins, specific comments referring to specific sections, and so on. So now you know exactly how to get detailed feedback, and it's not just going to be, I got a 20 out of 25 on my outline. Okay, what does that even mean, right? So next up, I'd just like to go over the activity that's due. I'd like to go over the activity that's due on Friday. Just like the activity that was due, more than a week ago, the Friday before last Friday. This is going to be a recorded speech. You're going to record it using GoReact. You're then going to submit it, and then you're going to comment onto your classmates' videos. What this activity is designed to do is to have us focus a little bit on how we can adjust our voice throughout our speeches, and then how that can affect the delivery of that speech. Now, you might have seen that a very bad speech uses what's called a monotone. The speaker only speaks in one volume, never changes it throughout, so that they keep talking, and as they keep talking, it slowly becomes flatter and flatter, until eventually they are only speaking at one set volume and rate. Now, while this isn't difficult to hear, it can be difficult to listen to, especially if for longer speeches that are upwards of 8 minutes, it can be harder and harder to continue to focus attention towards one particular monotone all the time. That's why we want to vary it up. That's why we want to change up the volume of our speech, change up the rate of our speech, change our emotion of the speech, say things with a little bit more happiness, a little bit more remorse, a little bit more anger, and so on. By varying our voice, we're better able to keep the audience engaged with what we're saying. This is a critical skill to master, especially as our speeches get longer and longer. So here you can see the full instructions of this activity. At its most basic level, what you're doing is you're picking any paragraph from any source. It says literature here. I'm gonna change that, but it doesn't have to be from literature. It can be from a movie, a song, a play, whatever, right? It just has to be a paragraph from any source of media, and all you're doing is throughout that paragraph, you're just annotating where at specific points you would like to emphasize key words, at which point you'd like to dial back certain phrases, go a little bit quieter, and at which point you'd like to leave a little bit more of a pause. By changing that up, you'll see that it alters your delivery of the paragraph. Then all you need to do is just record yourself doing that and submit it on GoReact for credit. Anyone have any questions on the activity? Okay, so on that note then, we're just going to go ahead and get started with chapter 9. This is going to be a shorter lecture for today. We're going to get out pretty early, but it's still a very important skill to demonstrate, because this week is all about how to deliver a good speech. Not just in what we write, but in the physical manner that we present it. Obviously, before we even talk about what we do with our bodies during our speech, the most obvious element we need to address is what to actually do with our words. Because I've had this feeling, and I'm sure you've all had this feeling at some point, where you listen to a speaker and it's like the words just flow. There's never any pause, any change in their rhythm. They always just know exactly what to say. They have the perfect sentence already formed up. They're using metaphor, idioms, examples, turns of phrases, even jokes. And you're wondering to yourself, okay, how can I possibly get to that level? How can I become a speaker who can just use their words so effortlessly without ever needing to stop and actually think about what I'm saying? I need to stop to think about what I'm saying when I'm talking to like friends and family, much less when I'm giving a speech to a public setting. In this chapter, what we're going to be doing is we're going to be covering 3 key guidelines you want to be using when actually considering the words you're selecting for your speech. This is what's called a speaking style. Everyone has their own individual speaking style. There is no one set, proper, right way to speak in public. Everyone has their own speaking style. What I encourage you to do is to lean into yours. Don't try to force a false speaking style. Don't try to come up here and then suddenly try to sound like you're Abe Lincoln on the Hill, where you come up all stiff and fancy and with proper posture going, "Greetings, fellow students. Today I would wish to inquire upon you, to which one might perchance peruse the contents of my oratory." No one actually talks like that. You don't talk like that. I don't talk like that. So don't try to force an artificial speaking style. Try to speak in a way that feels natural to you. This chapter isn't going to teach you how to speak differently. It's just going to teach you, here are 3 things to keep in mind while you're speaking in a way that's natural to you. So, we're going to skip the warm-up question, and we're going to first compare some differences between oral versus written speaking style. Now, we want to address this because last week we just covered how to actually write a speech, but now we need to make a critical distinction. A speaking style has a lot of key differences from a written style, simply because of the fact that speaking has a much different conversational flow than writing. With writing, you can usually write a longer sentence. You can usually write a sentence that stretches on and use a little bit more fancy vocabulary, because you're not actually expecting anyone to respond to it. You're not expecting someone to just sit there and listen to you the whole time you're saying it. You can write it and you know they'll read it, and then you know they won't drop out of the sentence halfway through. With oral speaking style, you have to frame your sentences as if you're always trying to engage your audience, as if you always want to give them some invitation to respond. The reality is that the longer your sentences in oral speaking style, the harder it is to maintain that attention. Now, this isn't a universal rule, but you want to try and be a little bit more snappy with what you're saying. You want to get to the point a little bit quicker. You want to try to drive to the audience's attention a little bit more directly. By doing so, you always make sure that the audience never loses you, because while it's easy to read, it's harder to actually sit and listen. So just some key differences between written style is that, of course, it's going to be more structured. You can sit there and you can plan things out. You can type out a sentence. You can rewrite a sentence. Nothing's really constraining you. Nothing's forcing you to think of it on the spot. With oral speaking style, now you're a little bit more off the cuff. You don't have to totally come with words on your own, but you have to recall a little bit, okay, what did I write in my outline? What's my next idea? How should this next sentence sound like? Am I sounding a little bit awkward? And so on. It also oral speaking style does have a huge benefit, though, in that it lends itself to a more interactive nature. You're not just your audience doesn't just need to be a passive part of your speech. I don't know why my mouth is so dry. Sorry if the mic's picking it up, but a good public speaker doesn't just let the audience listen to them. A good public speaker actively involves the audience in the speech. And it can be incredibly easy, right, Daisha? And example out the way. Right, Janelle?
Right.
There you go, right? So, it's just as easy as just asking your audience a question, asking them to get a little bit involved. By doing so, the audience now feels like they are an active part of a conversation, not like they just have to sit there and keep their eyes open. Don't worry about it, Dave. It also means it's less formal, as you can see by the missing parentheses that's now going to haunt me forever. Oral speaking style doesn't mean that we need to come up and sound like a Roman senator. It just means that we just speak in a way that's natural to us. I very rarely mark people down for sounding unprofessional, whatever that means, because it's more important that you sound that your voice remains your own. The audience picks up on that authenticity. They want to hear the real you. They want to listen to the real you. That's just another strength that oral speaking style lets you shine through. It lets your voice carry the speech. It's very difficult to do when actually writing an outline. In terms of contemporary speaking style, now I encourage you to watch this video. I won't show it because last week I realized how kind of dumb it was to screen share and show you a video during a lecture that you could just watch on your own time, but whatever. But I would like to address that I mentioned that there is no set right way to speak in public. There is no perfect public speaking style. That's so true because we've seen speaking styles shift just in a matter of years. Contemporary speaking styles now, research has shown, is typically now more focused on a more emotional side of speaking. They're focused more on telling stories, revealing personal aspects. They're a little bit more dramatic. They try to use more specific details and examples. They don't really refer to abstract concepts anymore. It's less about talking about freedom and more about talking about my story in the United States, trying to fight for my freedom, and so on. This can especially be true with Donald Trump. He emphasizes a more conversational style of public speaking. He tries to phrase his content in a little bit more of a direct manner, as if he's just talking to someone. He uses conversational words. He tries to tell specific stories, refer to specific characters, specific settings, and so on. That's just one example of the many ways that public speaking style has shifted, whereas 50 or 60 years ago, it'd be very rare for a president to actually deliver a speech on their personal life. So, that kind of reminds me a little bit, I think it was Rodrigo who last week kind of did bring it up, like, everything you're teaching us, like Donald Trump kind of does the opposite. That's true. The guideline to what is effective public speaking shifts almost by the year.
Professor,
what's up, Rodrigo?
Have you heard the last one that he came through with?
Was this at the Tulsi rally?
No, the Kung Flu.
Oh, that's an old one. He came up with that one a while ago.
Oh, okay.
But
like when he says, he likes to emphasize his words as well. Like when he says China, he says China. Like it's something about his speeches are just like weird.
Very much so. He very much uses a lot of emphasis, a lot of repetition. He also likes to use his hands to emphasize key words. He likes this gesture a lot. He likes saying China, like that kind of thing, right? That little teacup gesture. But just another example of, again, his public speaking style has definitely shifted, and it's shifted our entire political discourse. It shifted how a lot of politicians now speak with their voting base. So, but this doesn't occur in a vacuum. This goes all the way back since George Bush would sit down and people would say he's the president they'd like to have a beer with. This is a shift that's been gradually happening for the past 2 decades, and this is just one more sign of it. So, I'm just going to tell you 3 basic standards you want to have to maintain a competent oral speaking style. Remember, your speaking style works for you. You just want to keep these in mind so that you're sure that it doesn't distract from the actual effectiveness of your speech. The first you want to keep in mind is clarity. Now, I don't really know how great I am at maintaining clarity when I'm giving you a lecture, but you want to try to maintain clarity. You want to try to make it clear what you're actually saying to your audience, because the goal of every speech is to have your audience effectively receive your message, to know what's being said. If you're saying something, but the audience isn't picking up on your actual meaning, then you definitely need to reframe it. That's why, more often than not, you want to try to keep things simple and concise with how you're framing it. That's where I kind of fail a little bit. But I say that a lot. I say, but these videos are making me so aware of all my bad public speaking habits. But there you go. You want to try to keep it direct because, again, the audience's attention is a limited resource. You want to make it clear to them, here's what I'm saying, here's what you should get out of it, moving on to the next point. You also want to avoid technical terms that your audience might not necessarily know. Not everyone has your depth and level of experience in a particular subject. Jargon is any term that's technical to a specific field. So, can anyone give me an example of jargon, a word that only really makes sense within a specific context, within a specific field?
I can.
Go ahead, Rodrigo.
Do you know what an APU is?
I do not. What is an APU?
It's what like normal people would call it a turbine or a turbine, like whatever you want to how to pronounce. It's the engine of an airplane.
Could you explain it? Sorry to cut you off a little bit, Rodrigo, but could you explain what an APU is without using anything related, without using any words related to aircraft, air travel, piloting, anything like that?
No, it means air power unit, but people won't just know. Like I would have to go around and explain it to them. So that doesn't make sense to use in a speech where you have people that work the gate at an airport. They not necessarily know what goes down with an airplane, you know?
Exactly. Now, I wouldn't necessarily, it doesn't make sense to use in a speech. You can use it in a speech, but you have to explain the term to the actual audience. Because I feel like I feel like most people in this class, I might go on a limb there, don't have their pilot's license yet. So you just want to explain that term before moving on.
Right.
Jargon can range from almost anything. A lot of words we might all take for granted might not necessarily be the case. Because is touchdown jargon? Is that a technical term? Is a touchdown jargon? Anyone?
No, a touchdown would not be a jargon.
How so?
Because everybody's familiar with that. When you're talking about touching down, you're talking about an airplane. It's coming down, it's landing.
Well, what if I meant touchdown in terms of football?
Right. Okay, so that would have another meaning then.
And not even a touchdown in term. Can you explain touchdown in terms of air travel without actually using any terms related to aircraft? I guess you could. I guess you could say it's when the plane is no longer in the air, I guess, or when it first touches down to the ground. But
right.
I guess my example is touchdown in terms of football. Is that jargon? Is scoring a touchdown a technical term?
Could be, depend whether or not the people knows the football.
And that's what makes it jargon. Exactly.
Yeah.
If it depends on if someone needs to first be familiar with the sport or at least understand what football is, that's what makes it jargon. So we might think it's a universally known term, but that's because we might live here in the States where football is incredibly popular. What if someone from another culture hears a term like touchdown? They won't really understand what it means. In fact, what if a person from another culture hears the term football? That might not be the first thing they might think of is not necessarily related to American football, and so on. All of these are examples of jargon, and you always want to keep that clear to the audience what that specific word means. That's also why, like we talked about in our chapter on audience analysis, you want to understand where your audience comes from, your audience's background, their past experience with that topic, and so on. Because all of that can dictate, okay, how much time do I really need to spend explaining the jargon I'm using in my speech? You also want to avoid using cultural euphemisms and turns of phrases. So you want to try to keep things a little bit more surface level and not be so contextual to a culture. I just realized that everything I said there did not satisfy clarity at all. Basically, you want to try to make it in a way that as many people as possible can understand what you're saying. That can also include using slang a little bit less. A lot of, I mean, I hear what my high school students say now, and I have literally no idea what is on fleek. I don't know what that is. That's already an outdated term. I have no idea what that means. And that's just one example where slang can help or can reduce the clarity of your message. Next is precision. Now, just like how we want to try and keep our message clear to the audience, we also want to try to pick our words selectively so that they are able to achieve the maximum intended effect. That's why when we are choosing our words, we want to keep things familiar to us. That's why I emphasize speak in a way that's natural to you. Use the terms and vocabulary that you're used to using. Because if you try to use words unfamiliar to you, if you decide to whip out the thesaurus to try to give your speech a little bit more fanciness, then it just doesn't sound authentic in the slightest. I've had so many students come up and suddenly sound like they're out of a Jane Austen novel, where they come up and they go, and they would say something like, "Greetings. Today, on this hallowed occasion, I am here to elucidate a point upon which we must finally portend to salvate our mother Gaia." And you go, okay, so you want us to save the world. Okay, why couldn't you just say that instead? Like we talked about. You want the audience to actually process what you're saying, and it's immediately apparent to them when you're using a word that you're not familiar with, when you're using something just because you think it sounds good, but it can actually both distract from the clarity of your message and weaken the actual effectiveness of that message. So try to use words that are familiar to you. try to use words that you think would best resonate with the audience. That would try to convey or create specific emotions in that audience. And lastly, on that note, is the dimension of vividness. Now, in your outline, I told you to use specific details and examples, times when, with specific people, events, places, things of that nature. You want to use vividness because the audience can't connect to a dry and boring description of something. They can't connect to something vague or abstract. They can only connect to an image you put in their mind if they're able to place themselves in a specific time, place, activity, whatever. Because I could dryly describe to you the act of eating. I could describe to you my dinner, and I could say, what I did was I took 2 hunks of cow meat and then I held them over a flame until they were no longer raw, and then I put them in my mouth to digest for later consumption. That's very dry. I could say something like, oh, I ate steak last night. That's very dry. But by using vividness and by telling you, okay, you know what I did? Last night, I seasoned some steak with some Himalayan pink salt, a little bit of parsley flakes, seared that a little bit in some soy sauce, give a little bit of an Eastern flavor, broiled that in some ramen, cut that up, and then made myself a nice ramen dish. That right there is a little bit more vivid. That's what actually makes you hungry. That's what actually makes you want to hear more about the meal. Although you're probably judging my cooking now. Oh well. So always try to speak in a way that evokes detail and image. Always try to use those sensory words. Don't just describe what something looks like. Don't just describe the appearance of something. Describe what something smells like, what something feels like, the texture of it, what something hears like, the background details going on all around us as we're working, how we have an open window and a bird singing on a tree, how as we're walking, we hear the wind blowing through trees. I keep using trees as my example. So always try to speak in a vivid way to evoke that image. Whenever you've read a really good book, what sucks you into the book isn't the literal events happening. It's how the author describes them. It's how the author is able to transplace you into that situation. Some specific tools you can use to use vividness in your speaking style. Of course, you can use metaphor. Metaphor is a great way to compare 2 distinct concepts. They help us give a great frame of reference for something else. A simile is like a metaphor, but it implies a direct comparison. It says something is like something. Metaphor is more subtle. It's more implicit. If I say school is a prison, it's a direct comparison. Or school is like a prison, that's a direct comparison. I'm directly comparing school to prison. If I said something more along the lines of school, I had a really good example with that prison one, but if I said something more along the lines of, I don't know, I'm failing here, but I had a really good one on my other PowerPoint. But if I said something more along the lines of, his eyes were blue and I was reminded of the ocean, that's a metaphor. I'm not directly comparing, I'm not directly saying his eyes are the ocean or like the ocean, but I evoke that. Or if I say something like, I don't know, but it's, yeah. You can also use alliteration. Now, alliteration is repeating the same sound over and over again because that gives it a little bit more of a cohesive flow. Alliteration is something along the lines of, Sally sells seashells by the seashore. It flows a little bit better. It's a little bit easier to listen to for the audience. You can also use repetition. As we talked about a little bit earlier in this lecture, by repeating a key word or phrase, you really drive it home to the audience. You deliver emphasis to it and you make your speech carry that much more weight behind it. So you think of, for example, Think of a lot of famous speeches in the past that have continually evoked that same phrase over and over again to really drive home the importance of what the speaker is trying to convey to the audience. If not now, when? If not who, whom, and so on, right? What example makes? I don't know why I'm completely blanking on examples. I don't know, but ask not what you can do for your country. Ask what you can do. Ask not what your country can do for you. Glad this is going to be on YouTube. Ask what you can do for your country. That's a great example of antithesis. Antithesis is where you're essentially creating two contrasting elements, arranging them together in a sentence to demonstrate that contrast. It gives a little bit more impact. Another example would be the opening lines of Charles Dickens' book, A Tale of Two Cities. It was the best of times, it was the worst of times. It was a season of hope, it was a season of despair. That demonstrates the impact of, okay, in some parts of the world, golden age. In other parts of the world, they're rolling people off with a guillotine. It demonstrates that contrast. So, here's just an example of how adjusting your speaking style can actually enhance how it comes across to an audience, but I'll let you watch the video on your own time. So, that covers chapter 9 of the lecture. Does anyone have any questions on the content we just covered?
I'm good.
Not at the moment, Professor. It's all good.
All right, cool. So, like I said, it's a little bit of a shorter lecture. So, that wraps up the lecture for today. On Wednesday, we're going to be going through chapter 10. I'm going to give you a physical demonstration of every nonverbal skill you need to practice for your speeches. So, if you can't make it, that's fine, but I I absolutely stress you need to watch the next lecture. I feel like I'm hyping up my next video release, but oh well. So, have a great rest of your Monday, y'all. I'll see y'all on Wednesday. If you have any questions, feel free to send me an email or drop up my office hours. Later.
Professor.
Bye, Professor.
What's up, Rodrigo?
It's kind of painful to watch myself talk